Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling AI and bias.
Oh, this is a big one.
It really is. And we've got a whole stack of sources to dig into academic papers, news articles. We even peeked into the dark web a bit.
Sounds like quite the mix.
It is. And by the end of this deep dive, you'll not just know what AI bias is, but kind of where it comes from, the implications, what people are trying to do about it, the whole thing.
It's amazing how much this topic has blown up recently. I mean, AI bias isn't just some little tech glitch. It's really woven into our own human biases and the systems we've built.
Yeah, it's almost like AI is holding up a mirror to society, but that reflection is going through some pretty powerful algorithms.
Exactly. So where do we start?
Well, we thought we'd jump right in with this academic paper. It's titled AI and Racial Bias. Seems like a good foundation, don't you think?
Definitely. This paper really lays the groundwork, helps us understand the nuances of racial bias in AI. One of the key things they emphasize is how important it is to be precise about what we even mean by bias. They break it down into these three types: G1, G2, and G3.
Okay, so unpack those for us. What's G1 bias?
G1 is essentially the AI reflecting existing societal inequalities. Like, it's mirroring the biases that are already in the data it's trained on.
So if historical data shows that there's a higher arrest rate in certain neighborhoods, and AI trained on that data might then predict a higher risk of reoffending for people from those areas.
Exactly. And while that might be statistically accurate, it doesn't make it fair or just. It perpetuates existing disparities.
So it's not that the AI is intentionally biased, but it's reflecting the biases baked into the information it's learned from.
Got it. What about G2 then?
G2 bias stems from unrepresentative training data. Imagine you're teaching an AI about cats, but you only show it pictures of Siamese cats.
So it might not recognize a Persian as a cat. Right. Or if an AI is trained on data that doesn't represent the full diversity of human experiences, its outputs are going to be skewed.
Like if facial recognition software is primarily trained on images of people with lighter skin tones.
Exactly. It might have a harder time accurately identifying people with darker skin tones, and that can lead to all sorts of problems.
Makes sense. Okay, last one, G3 bias. What's that about?
G3 bias comes from flaws in the AI's design itself. So even if the data is diverse and representative, the way the AI is built can introduce bias.
Like a hiring algorithm that unintentionally favors candidates who use certain words or writing style.
Exactly. So you see, bias can creep in from multiple angles: the data, the training, and even the way the AI is designed.
This paper doesn't just talk theory, though. They get into some real-world examples that are pretty striking.
Oh, absolutely. One that really stood out to me was about an AI image generation tool. When prompted to create an image of an American man and his fancy house, it produced a very different image than when prompted with an African man and his fancy house.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how bias can show up in unexpected places, even in something as seemingly simple as an image generator. It really makes you think.
Right. And this paper doesn't just point out the problems, it grapples with solutions too. It explores the evolving legal frameworks around AI bias, raising some really tough questions about liability, how to define prohibited racial bias in these systems. It's complex stuff.
Sounds like we're still in the very early stages of figuring out how to regulate this technology effectively.
We are. But this paper is a good start, a solid foundation for the rest of our deep dive. It gives us the vocabulary, the context, the framework to think critically about AI bias.
Okay, so now that we've got a grasp on the different types of bias and how they can pop up, let's get into some more real-world scenarios. Our next source is an article that takes us into the dark side of AI, the world of bad GPT.
Buckle up, this one's a bit chilling. It's a stark reminder that AI can be a double-edged sword, capable of causing real harm in the wrong hands.
It exposes how cybercriminals are weaponizing AI to create really sophisticated phishing scams, deepfakes, even malware.
Scary stuff.
There's this story in the article about an employee at a multinational company in Hong Kong who got tricked into transferring millions of dollars during a deepfake conference call.
Oh, yeah, that one was wild. Hackers orchestrated the whole thing. It just shows how dangerous this technology can be when used for malicious purposes. And it makes you wonder, how do you even regulate something like the dark web, where these tools are being traded and refined?
Right, it's this whole other layer of complexity.
Absolutely. And then the article talks about this thing called jailbreaking AI models. Basically, it's manipulating the AI to bypass any safety restrictions that were built in.
So it's kind of like giving someone a blueprint to a high security vault. They could use it to design an even better vault Or they could use it to figure out how to break into existing ones.
Exactly. And the article also highlights another emerging challenge, voice cloning. As this technology becomes more accessible, it's going to be even harder to detect fraudulent activity.
Think about it. If anyone can create a convincing deepfake of your voice, how do you prove you weren't the one who authorized a bank transfer or something?
Scary thought, right? This article serves as a real wake-up call. We need robust legal frameworks, proactive security measures, all of it, to keep pace with this rapidly evolving landscape.
Okay, so we've seen how AI bias can perpetuate discrimination and inequality, and now we've seen how it can be exploited for criminal activity.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. Let's shift gears a bit now and see how these issues are playing out in the mainstream media. Our next source is a 60-minute segment that gives a really good overview of large language models, or LLMs, like ChatGPT.
Oh, I saw that one. It's really well done. And they have that interview with Timnit Gebru, who's a prominent AI ethicist.
She's the one who got pushed out of Google, right?
Yeah, after she raised concerns about the risks of certain AI systems, she's definitely not afraid to speak her mind.
She makes a really strong case for how these LLMs, by taking in massive amounts of data from the internet, can inherit and amplify existing biases.
She uses this great analogy. Just like bullies can drive certain groups offline, biased data can skew an LLM's understanding of the world. If certain voices are underrepresented or silenced online, the AI will reflect that.
So the AI ends up learning a distorted version of reality.
Exactly. And the segment also explores the limits of current approaches to mitigating bias, like training AI to detect and filter out toxic content.
Which seems like a good idea, right?
Sure, but Gebru argues that it's like playing whack-a-mole. You're constantly reacting to harmful content instead of addressing the root cause.
So it's reactive rather than proactive.
Exactly. She's advocating for more proactive oversight, regulation of AI, similar to how we regulate other industries.
Like food, medicine, transportation.
Yeah, those kinds of things.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
AI is getting so powerful, we can't afford to just let it develop unchecked.
I think that's a key takeaway from this segment. It emphasizes how urgent this issue is. We can't ignore AI bias or put it off. It's a problem we need to address now.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of AI bias, explored its dark side, heard from a leading AI ethicist. Now let's zoom in on a specific case study of AI bias in action. Our next source is a video from AI researcher Yannick Kilcher's channel. It focuses on Google's Gemini model.
Oh, this one is interesting, especially given Google's reputation for, being an AI leader. Their launch of Gemini was, well, let's just say it was overshadowed by some pretty significant bias issues.
Yeah, Kilcher doesn't hold back in his analysis. He breaks it down, shows how Gemini's image generation was skewed, refusing to create certain images of white people while easily generating similar images for other racial groups.
And he's pretty critical of Google's response, calling it more PR spin than a genuine attempt to address the problem.
The video also gives us a glimpse into the inner workings of a tech giant like Google. You see how a small group of people can have a huge influence on decisions, maybe even stifle dissent, even in a company that's supposed to be all about innovation?
It's a reminder that even the biggest tech companies aren't immune to these problems.
So what's Kilcher's solution? What does he think we should do about AI bias?
He suggests using humor and memes to draw attention to the issue. It's an interesting idea. Make it relatable, engage a wider audience. Maybe that's what it takes to put pressure on companies like Google to actually take action.
So what can we learn from this Google Gemini case?
I think it reinforces a few key points. One, even the most sophisticated tech companies are not immune to AI bias. Two, we need more transparency and accountability from these companies. And three, public pressure can be a powerful tool for holding them responsible.
Okay, so we're seeing a clear pattern emerge. AI bias isn't just theoretical, it's happening in the real world, with real consequences. Now let's get back to the nuts and bolts of why this is happening. Our next source is an article titled, "Why Can Large Language Models Be Biased?" It breaks it down in a pretty concise way.
This one really gets into the nitty-gritty. They start with a clear definition of bias in this context. It's when these models generate outputs that unfairly favor or discriminate against certain groups, reinforce stereotypes, or omit viewpoints. Basically, they inherit our prejudices.
So it's like they absorb all the bias in the data they're trained on, and then they just spit it back out.
Precisely. And they break it down into three main reasons for this bias: data quality, associative learning, and lack of contextual understanding.
Okay, data quality makes sense. If the data used to train the AI is biased, the AI is going to be biased too. But what's associative learning?
LLMs learn by identifying patterns and associations in the data. If the data contains biased associations, let's say, linking certain professions to specific genders or ethnicities, the AI will internalize those biases and reproduce them, even if they're not explicitly stated.
It's like if an AI learned about the world by only reading children's books from the 1950s.
Exactly. It might assume that all doctors are men and all nurses are women, even though the world has changed a lot since then.
So they're really good at pattern recognition, but not so good at understanding the nuances of meaning or the social and historical context.
Exactly. And that's where the lack of contextual understanding comes in. LLMs might produce outputs that are grammatically correct and statistically plausible, but they can still be biased or offensive because they're missing that deeper level of understanding.
So it's not just about feeding them more data, it's about teaching them to understand the world in a more nuanced and contextually aware way.
Right. But it's not all doom and gloom. The article also explores strategies for mitigating bias in LLMs.
Oh, good. Give us some hope here.
They talk about using more diverse and balanced training data, pre-processing techniques to filter out biases, post-processing methods like bias mitigating algorithms. There are a lot of promising approaches being developed.
So it's not a hopeless situation.
Definitely not. We can make progress if developers, researchers, and even users work together to address these challenges.
Okay, that's good to hear. So this article gives us a more technical understanding of why LLMs can be biased and what steps we can take to address the issue.
And it emphasizes that bias in AI isn't always intentional. It often stems from unconscious biases embedded in the data, the algorithms, and even the way we think about the world.
That's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
But speaking of unconscious bias, there's another aspect of AI and bias that we need to discuss: deepfakes. This same article takes a detour into that world, and I think it's a crucial part of this whole conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Deepfakes are a prime example of how AI can be weaponized. They can be so convincing, it's almost impossible to tell them apart from real content.
It's getting harder and harder to believe what we see and hear online.
Exactly, and that has huge implications for our society, for trust, for accountability. The article talks about this thing called the liar's dividend.
What's that?
It's the way that the mere possibility of deepfakes casts doubt on genuine information, even if there's no evidence of manipulation. It creates this atmosphere of suspicion and uncertainty.
So how do deepfakes tie back into our discussion of AI bias?
Well, deepfakes are often driven by the same biases we see in other AI systems. For example, they're disproportionately used to target women and minorities.
It's like the biases that already exist in society are amplified and weaponized through deepfakes.
Exactly. And this brings us to a crucial point. We need to be aware of how these biases can be exploited, not just in AI systems, but in the media we consume, the information we share, all of it. We need to be critical thinkers and develop strategies for discerning truth from falsehood.
It's like we need a whole new set of media literacy skills for this AI-driven world.
I think you're right. We need to be more discerning, more skeptical, and more aware of the potential for manipulation. And we need to demand transparency and accountability from those who are creating and deploying these technologies.
Okay, so we've covered the theoretical foundations of AI bias, delved into the dark web, the mainstream media, and the world of deepfakes. Now, for a change of pace, let's look at a report from McKinsey that takes on AI bias from a more pragmatic, business-focused perspective. It's called Notes from the AI Frontier: Tackling Bias in AI and in Humans.
Oh, this one's interesting. It offers a more nuanced and balanced view, I think. It acknowledges the complexities while advocating for a proactive approach to mitigating the harmful effects of AI bias.
And right off the bat, they make this crucial point. Human decision-making is prone to bias too. AI isn't necessarily making things worse, it's just revealing a problem that's always been there.
Right, it's like holding up a mirror to our own biases.
Exactly. And they even share this anecdote about a British medical school that got in trouble for using a biased admissions algorithm. But get this, the algorithm was designed to mimic the decisions of human admissions officers.
Oh, wow, so it was basically replicating human bias.
Yeah, and it actually ended up being less biased than the human admissions officers at other schools.
That's fascinating and a little bit ironic, isn't it?
It is. It highlights how AI can expose the biases that we might not even be aware of in our own decision-making processes.
So we can't blame it all on the machines.
Exactly. And the report goes on to stress how important it is to remember that bias in AI often comes from the data it's trained on, which can reflect societal or historical inequities.
They give a lot of examples, like criminal justice models that overrepresent certain neighborhoods because of overpolicing, or financial models that undersample certain groups, leading to skewed results.
It's like this vicious cycle. The AI inheriting the biases of the data it's trained on, whether those biases were intentional or not.
It is. And this report doesn't shy away from the challenges either. Like, how do we even define and measure fairness when it comes to AI? There's no single universally accepted definition.
It's like trying to measure happiness or something, right? Everyone has a different idea of what it means.
A great analogy. And that's why it's so crucial to carefully consider the specific context of each AI application, what fairness actually means in that situation.
So what solutions does this McKinsey report propose? Are they just throwing up their hands and saying it's too complicated?
Not at all. They highlight a bunch of technical and operational approaches for mitigating bias in AI, everything from pre-processing techniques that clean up the data to auditing data and models for fairness. They really stress the human element too.
Like, it's not just about fixing the technology, it's about human judgment and collaboration.
Exactly. We need diverse perspectives, ethical considerations, multidisciplinary approaches, the whole shebang.
So it's about using the best tools we have, but also making sure those tools are used responsibly.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. From the different types of bias to the dangers of the dark web, the challenges of regulating powerful technologies, and the potential for both good and bad uses of AI, we've seen just how complex this issue really is.
It's multifaceted for sure, and we're just getting started.
We are. But before we dive into the next layer, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll explore a paper that goes even deeper into the complexities of racial bias in AI. Stay tuned.
All right, so before the break, we were about to get into this paper that really digs into racial bias in AI. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah, this one felt particularly relevant after all the other sources we've looked at. It uses that Australian Human Rights Commission framework we talked about earlier, the G1, G2, G3 types of bias.
Right, it helps to have those categories to really analyze how bias can show up in different ways.
Totally. And they use those categories to look at actual examples, which makes it way more concrete than just talking about theory.
Absolutely. One example they discussed was predictive policing algorithms and how G1 bias, the reflection of existing societal inequalities, can lead to some really problematic outcomes.
Yeah, even if the algorithm is statistically accurate, it can still perpetuate unfairness.
Exactly. Like, if the data shows a higher arrest rate in certain neighborhoods because of historical over-policing,
Then the AI might predict that people from those areas are more likely to reoffend, even if they haven't actually done anything wrong.
it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, reinforcing those existing disparities. The algorithm isn't intentionally biased, but it's learned from biased data, so.
It's going to spit out biased results. And that highlights how deeply intertwined AI is with our social structures and those historical inequalities.
Exactly. It's not a neutral tool. It's shaped by the context it operates in.
It makes you wonder, how do we even begin to disentangle that?
Mhm.
If the real world is biased, can we really expect AI trained on that world to be anything else?
That's a tough question, and one that researchers are grappling with right now. The paper goes on to talk about G2 bias, which comes from unrepresentative or flawed training data. They give the example of facial recognition technology that's mainly been trained on images of lighter skin tones.
Which means it's probably going to struggle to accurately identify people with darker skin tones, right?
Exactly, and that can lead to all sorts of problems, misidentification, wrongful arrests, you name it.
It's a stark reminder of how crucial it is to have diverse and representative data sets when we're training these AI systems. If the data is skewed, incomplete, or biased in any way, the AI is going to reflect those flaws.
No doubt about it. We can't just assume the data is neutral. We have to be really intentional about building data sets that reflect the full spectrum of human diversity.
So we've got those two bias in the data itself, but then there's that G3 bias, which is different, right? It's not about the data, it's about the design of the AI system.
Exactly. G3 bias comes from flaws in the system's design, not just the data it's fed. This could be anything from using the wrong algorithm to a lack of diversity on the development team.
So even with perfectly balanced data, if the people building the AI system have blind spots or unconscious biases, that can still lead to biased outcomes.
Absolutely. And this paper pointed out that G3 bias can be really subtle and hard to catch. It underscores how important it is to think about bias throughout the entire AI development process, from data collection and algorithm selection to model training and deployment.
We have to bake those considerations in from the beginning.
Right. And it's not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process of evaluation and refinement. We need to be constantly vigilant and proactive in addressing bias, no matter where it might crop up.
So this paper really lays out those three categories of bias G1, G2, and G3, and how they can manifest in the real world. But they didn't stop there, did they? They also talked about generative AI.
They did, like those language models and image generators we've been discussing.
Yeah, the paper points out that even those seemingly creative and harmless AI tools can exhibit racial bias too.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that bias can show up in unexpected places. It's not just about the algorithms used for high-stakes decisions, it's also about the subtle ways bias can creep into everyday technology. Remember that example we discussed from that earlier paper where an AI image generator produced vastly different images for an American man in his fancy house compared to an African man in his fancy house?
Yeah, it's kind of disturbing how easily these biases can be embedded in something as seemingly simple as an image generator,
Definitely. And this paper goes beyond identifying the problem. They also grapple with how to address it within a legal framework.
which is a whole other can of worms.
Right. How do you define prohibited racial bias in these systems? How do you establish clear liability standards for the people who create and use them?
It's like trying to regulate something that's constantly evolving. By the time you write a law, the technology has already moved on. It's a moving target.
And this paper dives into those complexities, highlighting the challenges of keeping our legal frameworks up to speed with the rapid pace of AI development. But they don't shy away from the tough ethical questions either.
Like, should AI systems be allowed to just mirror the existing inequalities in our society? Or should we be actively trying to counteract those inequalities through AI?
That's a big debate, and this paper provides a framework for thinking about it. It forces us to consider the historical roots of bias, the different ways it can manifest in AI, and the ethical and legal challenges involved in addressing it.
Okay, so this paper gives us a really solid overview of racial bias in AI, and it raises some important questions that we need to grapple with as a society. Now, with this new understanding in mind, let's circle back to that McKinsey report we discussed earlier, Notes from the AI Frontier, Tackling Bias in AI and in Humans. It felt like it offered a more pragmatic, solutions-oriented perspective on these issues,
It did. They approached it from this really interesting angle, acknowledging that AI isn't inherently biased. It can both reflect and mitigate human biases.
which is a really important point, right? It means that there's hope for using AI as a force for good in the world.
Exactly. It's not about pitting humans against machines. It's about recognizing that both are capable of making biased decisions. The question is, can we leverage AI to help us make better, fairer decisions?
I like how they framed it that way because it's not about demonizing AI. It's about figuring out how to use it responsibly and ethically.
They highlighted how human decision-making is often opaque. We're not always aware of our own biases. But with AI, there's this potential for greater transparency. We can examine the algorithms, the data, the whole decision-making process.
And that transparency is key, right? If we can understand how an AI system arrived at a particular conclusion, we're in a much better position to identify and address any biases that might have influenced that outcome.
Absolutely. Transparency is crucial for accountability. And they also discussed how AI can help reduce our reliance on subjective interpretations of data.
Like, instead of relying on human judgment, which can be influenced by all sorts of biases, we can use algorithms that are trained to focus on objective factors.
Exactly.
Yep.
For example, in the case of loan applications, instead of having a loan officer who might be influenced by unconscious biases, you could use an algorithm that only considers factors like credit score and income.
It's like using AI to create a more level playing field, giving everyone a fair chance based on their merits, not their demographics.
Right, and they provided some compelling examples of how AI is already being used to improve decision-making in areas like criminal justice and financial lending, leading to fairer outcomes.
So there is real potential for AI to promote fairness and equity. But, of course, the report doesn't shy away from the flip side of that coin, the ways in which AI can also bake in and even amplify bias.
Right, and they emphasize that a lot of the time the culprit is the data itself. AI models are trained on data that reflects our world, and our world is full of historical inequities and societal biases.
So the algorithms are just mirroring the biases that already exist.
Often, yes. They actually pushed back on the term algorithmic bias, saying that data bias is often a more accurate description. The algorithms are usually just doing what they're designed to do. They're finding patterns in the data. If the data is biased, the results will be too.
They gave those examples about criminal justice models that overrepresent certain neighborhoods because of overpolicing or hiring algorithms that favor words more commonly found on men's applications.
Those examples illustrate how deeply AI is entangled with our societal structures and the biases that are baked into them.
It's like this feedback loop. AI both reflects and reinforces those biases. So it's not enough to just focus on building better algorithms. We need to address the root causes of bias in our society. We need to make sure the data we use to train these AI systems is actually representative and equitable.
Absolutely. It's about changing the systems, not just the tools. But even with perfect data, there's still this challenge of how we define and measure fairness in the context of AI. The report acknowledges that this is a really thorny issue.
Yeah, they talked about how challenging it is to come up with a universally applicable definition of fairness. What's fair in one context might not be fair in another.
Right, and different fairness metrics can sometimes lead to completely different conclusions. It's complicated.
So where do we go from here? How do we actually mitigate bias in AI systems while taking all of these complexities into account?
The report highlights a range of approaches: pre-processing techniques that cleanse the data of bias, post-processing methods that adjust the outputs of an AI system to ensure fairness, even this thing called adversarial training.
What is
It's
that?
where you essentially pit two AI systems against each other. One is trying to make fair predictions, while the other is trying to find and exploit any biases in those predictions. It's like a constant game of cat and mouse, forcing the first AI to become more and more fair over time.
Wow, that's a fascinating approach. It's
Yeah.
like using AI to fight bias in AI.
Right. They also talked about the importance of explainability in AI. If we can understand how an AI system is making its decisions, we're in a better position to identify and address any biases that might be lurking in there.
And they stress the need for ongoing monitoring and auditing of AI systems, right?
Exactly. It's not a one-time fix, it's an ongoing process. We need to be vigilant and proactive in addressing bias, constantly evaluating and refining these systems as they evolve.
So it sounds like it's not just about finding the right technical solutions. It's about human oversight, ethical considerations, and a commitment to constantly improving these systems.
I think that's a key takeaway from this report. It's not enough to just build better algorithms. We have to be engaged, critical, and intentional in the way we develop and deploy AI. It's about using the best tools available, but making sure those tools are being used for good. And it's about recognizing that this is a shared responsibility. We all have a role to play in shaping the future of AI.
Okay, so we've explored the different ways bias can creep into AI systems, we've seen real-world examples, and we've talked about some potential solutions. But now the big question is, what does all this mean for us moving forward? How do we navigate this world that's increasingly driven by AI?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've seen how AI bias is a reflection of our own biases, our social structures, our historical inequalities. It's not just a technological problem, it's a deeply human one.
And that can feel pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to address something so complex and multifaceted?
I think it starts with awareness. We need to be aware of the potential for bias, not just in the AI systems around us, but also in ourselves. We have to challenge our own assumptions, be willing to have those difficult conversations, and work toward creating a more equitable and just world.
That's such a crucial point. It's about recognizing our own biases, listening to the voices of those who are most impacted by these systems, and ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table when we're talking about the development and deployment of AI.
Absolutely. And it's about holding those in power accountable. We need to demand transparency from tech companies, push for regulations that protect against bias and discrimination, and support organizations that are working to make AI more ethical and inclusive.
So it's about individual action and collective effort. It's about using our voices, making informed choices, and working together to steer AI in a direction that benefits all of humanity.
That's what it comes down to. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix this problem. It's up to all of us to get involved, stay informed, and push for a future where AI is a force for good in the world.
And that's a great note to end on. So, to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into AI and bias. We hope you've learned something new, gained a deeper understanding of these complex issues, and maybe even felt inspired to take action. Keep those conversations going, stay curious, and stay engaged. So we've really unpacked a lot in this deep dive, all the ways bias can sneak into AI, real-world examples, and what people are doing to try and fix it.
It's been quite the journey. I think one of the biggest things we've seen is that AI isn't inherently good or bad. It's a tool. Like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill.
And that's a powerful realization, right? We can't just sit back and assume technology will automatically solve these problems. It's up to us to ensure that AI is developed and used ethically.
I think it starts with being aware of our own biases first and foremost, and then aware of the potential for bias in the systems we create.
Right. We need to be willing to question our own assumptions, to have those tough conversations, and to actively work towards a more just and equitable world.
And we can't let those who are building these powerful technologies off the hook. We need to demand transparency from them, push for regulations that protect against bias and discrimination, and support the organizations fighting for ethical AI.
So it's a combination of looking inward at ourselves and also pushing outward for change.
Exactly. And I know this can feel overwhelming, but to anyone listening who's feeling that way, remember, you're not alone. There are a lot of people working on these issues, and every voice makes a difference.
That's a good point. So what can our listeners actually do? What are some concrete steps they can take?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Keep learning about AI, its impact, the challenges, and the solutions. Read articles, listen to podcasts, have those conversations. The more we understand, the better equipped we'll be to advocate for change.
Being a critical consumer of information is crucial too, right?
hmm
Especially these days.
Oh, absolutely. Don't just take everything you read at face value. Question your sources. Look for those sensationalized headlines. They're everywhere. And really hone your skills in telling truth from falsehood. That's a superpower in this age of AI-generated content.
And most importantly, don't be afraid to use your voice.
Exactly. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues. Reach out to your elected officials. Advocate for policies that promote responsible AI. Support organizations that are fighting the good fight for ethical and inclusive AI. Every single voice matters.
Well said. This isn't just a problem for tech experts to solve. It's a societal issue, and we all have a part to play.
That's the heart of it, really. We need everyone at the table, ensuring that the development of AI reflects the needs and values of all communities, not just a select few.
Well, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. We've gone from the types of bias to the misuse, potential solutions, and now what we can do about it. I hope our listeners are walking away with a deeper understanding of these complex issues and maybe a little bit fired up to take action.
It's been a pleasure exploring all this with you.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those conversations going, stay curious, and stay engaged. Until next time.